Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on sustainable food packaging, Beyond the 3 R's, Unraveling the Path to Circularity, which has been made possible under Perennia's Food and Beverage Accelerator Program with support by our provincial and federal government's Canadian Agricultural Partnership. My name is Nancy Tregguno, and I'm a food scientist with Perennia Food and Agriculture. For anyone who isn't familiar with Perennia, we are a provincial development agency with the mission to support growth, transformation, and economic development in Nova Scotia's agriculture, seafood, and food and beverage sectors. Our services include product and process development, food safety, agricultural extension, mobile wine bottling, and analytical testing of cannabis, food, and beverages. I'm very excited today about our 3 guest speakers. I will do a brief introduction, and if you're curious to learn more about them, you can read their full bios on our website. I would first like to introduce Paul Shorthouse, who's joining us from BC. And Paul is the Interim Managing Director of the Canada Plastics Pact, and is one of Canada's leading experts in the emerging circular economy, providing leadership for those working at the intersection of business innovation, public policy, economic development, and sustainability. In addition to CPP, he has leadership roles at Circular Economy Leadership Canada and the Natural Step Canada. All of these roles placing him in the heart of the action for that transition that's underway towards a greener, more prosperous, low-carbon economy. Our second speaker will be Norm Mensour, the president of Scotia Recycling, which is located in Hansport, Nova Scotia. Scotia Recycling is known as Atlantic Canada's leader in collection, processing, and marketing of recyclable materials. Sustainability and environmental stewardship are key pillars for their evolution. Previously, Norm held senior management roles with Labatt, Big Eric's, and EnviroSystems. He obtained his doctorate in engineering science from the University of Western Ontario. And last, but certainly not least, we will hear from Dana McCauley, the Chief Experience Officer, Canada Food Innovation Network, which is also known as CFIN. And Dana is joining us from a little outside of Toronto. Dana is a value proposition-driven innovator who has successfully launched many food products and programs in collaboration with domestic and international food companies and entrepreneurs. With corporate, not-for-profit, and academic expertise and experience in marketing, product development, and creative services, she is an industry leader and food media personality with a diverse list of accomplishments, including being recognized in 2017 by WXN as one of Canada's most powerful women in the Trailblazers and Trendsetters category. So one more quick note, and we'll jump right into it. We are really looking forward to some discussion at the end of the presentations. In addition to our speakers at that time, we'll have Bob Kenny from Nova Scotia Department of Environment and Kurt Lascow-Pooley from Divert Nova Scotia available to also answer questions. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, the bottom of the Zoom window, at any time to post your questions. We're really curious to hear your perspectives, your comments, challenges, or successes around sustainable packaging. So let's get started. And Paul, I will turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Nancy. Thanks for the invitation and the introduction. And I'm very happy to share a little bit more on the Canada Plastics Pact and some of the work we're doing to create a more circular economy for plastic packaging in Canada and align with global best practices to really accelerate this work. So I will share a few slides and just provide a bit more information on the work of the CPP. So yeah, very, really to kick things off, just wanted to set a bit of context, and this may not be new for everyone, but I think it's important to ground ourselves in our current realities. And that's that globally, we are producing nearly 400 million tons of plastic every year, of which about, well, less than 2/3 is collected and only 15% or less is effectively recycled. So we are not in a great starting place. The trend is towards more plastic production. We're looking at 2 times the amount by 2040 and potentially 3 times more plastic leakage into the environment if interventions aren't taken. So we like to look at this diagram as sort of a guiding sort of insight, and that's from a 2020 report called Breaking the Plastic Wave by Pew Charitable Trusts and Systemic. And it really highlights that, there's no silver bullet. We can't recycle our way out of this. We need to be thinking about important solution pathways across sort of the whole innovation ecosystem and upstream and downstream. And so this wedge diagram sort of shows that we need to be thinking about combinations of reduction around substitution where it makes sense, and making sure we have all the different types of recycling available to manage the different types of materials that we will be working with over the next decade and beyond. So we've done some work before we launched the Canada Plastics Pact, but this number really tells us a little bit about some of our best estimates of what's being generated in Canada, which is about 1.9 million tons of plastic packaging in 2019. Only 12% of that packaging was estimated to effectively been recycled. So a huge amount of work still to be done. And if we look at it from, certain types of resins, flexibles, and films, only 1% is effectively being recycled. So really that was the generation for the need for the Canada Plastics Pact. We're a multi-stakeholder, industry-led platform. We're actually an initiative of the Natural Step Canada, which is a nonprofit charity. But what we do is try to bring the whole value chain together to focus on that plastics packaging ecosystem in Canada and really move the dial. We're part of a broader global network of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's Plastics Pact network. And really we're all these different pacts are aligned around a common vision for circular economy plastics. One is to really put an emphasis on eliminating the plastics we don't need. Secondly is to innovate and to ensure that we have sort of the reusable and recyclable and compostable options needed to ensure that at the end we can circulate these materials back into the economy and keep them out of the environment. So we are, as I mentioned, one of 15 pacts around the world. The US has a plastic pact. Mexico is soon to launch one in Chile and Colombia launching next month, several in Europe and Africa, and also in the sort of Australia, New Zealand region. And India is launching or has launched their pact as well. So we're starting to see this alignment, and all the pacts are sort of aligned around a common set of goals or targets. The timelines might vary a little bit based on regional nuances, but for Canada, we've set a target to define a list of plastic packaging that's no longer, that essentially a list of problematic or unnecessary packaging, and take measures to eliminate those where we can. Target 2 is about making sure that whatever we put on the market is 100% recyclable, reusable, or compostable by 2025. Thirdly, it's about undertaking ambitious actions to ensure we can collect and sort and effectively recycle those materials or manage those materials at end of life. And so we have a 50% target there. And lastly, to drive the demand for all of this, we need a target to integrate more recycled content. So a 30% recycled content target in all plastic packaging by 2025. So these are very ambitious goals. They require a lot of work and systems change to get there. But really, we have to do that by working with our partners right across the ecosystem. So when we launched in 2021, we had 41 founding partners. We're now up at close to 100 and growing, and really have focused that emphasis on the systems change and the collaboration and the solutions that are needed to move the dial. And so we act as a bit of this enabling platform, and we share best practices across other pacts. But as you'll see, we have a large group of sort of retailers and consumer goods companies, but we also have the upstream manufacturers and packaging converters, the downstream processors, stewardship agencies, some of the standards bodies, government agencies, and NGOs and others that will help to move the dial. And really looking at where we can affect kind of change by bringing these different players together and having effective conversations and building relationships to do projects together. So progress to date, we started with the material flows study. All these reports are available online on our website, really looking at the foundational numbers. I mentioned earlier some of those numbers, but 53% of the packaging on the market in Canada is rigid and 47% flexibles. And I mentioned how only 1% of flexibles is currently being recycled today. So we have a huge amount of challenges to deal with. The report looked at sort of the residential and the IC&I and deposit systems, but really that formed the foundation for the data that we needed to start with our roadmap and really set our priorities. So we've all, as a group, as an organization, developed a roadmap to 2025. And in that roadmap are 3 key priorities. 1, to reduce, reuse, and collect as much as we can. And that's dealing with the problematic and unnecessary. It's looking at reuse models, refill models. It's looking at the communications and behavior change that's needed to incentivize action. It's looking at R&D and innovation. Priority 2 is about optimizing the system. So how do we ensure that packaging is designed effectively for recyclability? How do we ensure the infrastructure investments are there for collection, recycling, and sortation? How do we ensure that we've got considerations for flexibles and food safe packaging and guidance on compostables, considerations around recycled content? So all those fall under priority 2. And then priority 3 is, we don't have all the information, and certainly some sectors are worse than others, like the IC&I sector. So we have been working to harmonize definitions and standards, collect better data, including on the IC&I sector, and looking at sort of the CPP to report annually so that we can really measure our progress towards our targets and make adjustments as needed. One of the things we're aligned around are the Golden Design Rules, which were developed by the Consumer Goods Forum for their Plastic Waste Coalition of Action. And the CGF brings together CEOs and senior management from some 400 retailers and manufacturers and other stakeholders across 70 countries, with a combined sales of about $6.2 trillion. So they've developed these Golden Design Rules as sort of a clear framework that aims to drive innovation, scalable actions that will result in less plastic packaging overall and easier to recycle packaging by 2025. And so it provides sort of a harmonized approach globally. And then in Canada, we're the ones implementing across our network the Golden Design Rules, which we've looked at from a Canadian perspective. So that's areas that include eliminating problematic issues like dyes and PET or expanded polystyrene. It looks at getting rid of unnecessary headspace and overwraps in packaging, for example. It looks to move away and move to more mono-material flexibles or materials like PE, removing labels and things from PE trays that are not recyclable, and focusing on rigid HDPE and polypropylene. And lastly, increasing the use of recycled content and improving on-pack labeling for consumers. So those are the 9 Golden Design Rules. Combine that with our roadmap priorities and our targets, and we've established these 8 different working groups, rapid action groups, to actually deliver on those different priorities. And these are voluntary groups that come together with support of our team and others to really advance different priorities. For redesigning packaging, for example, we developed a GDR microsite and are developing training programs for our partners. In the flexible space, we're developing a roadmap where we got alignment in the pathways to mono-material for polyethylene and tackling sort of the low-hanging fruit there. In recycled content, we've been looking to adopt the guide out of Australia and standardized food grade plastics with Health Canada. We've got a number of other collaborations going on with the US Plastics Pact around how to drive more recycled content and ensure we have the supply of resins required. In the compostable space, we've been developing some draft guidance on when to use compostables based on sort of some work that's been done in the UK. We have the source reduction list, and that includes defining sort of the criteria to assess what's problematic and developing a list, which we've got in draft right now with our partners for consultation. We have a narratives group that's working on really helping to tell the story, both the challenges and the opportunities where we're at, as well as looking at a sort of broader set of information to help raise the awareness. We have a data and reporting group that looks at that's working on a data and reporting strategy to harmonize how we report on this. And then lastly, soon to launch is our reuse rapid action group, which is really going to be focused on pilots and how to scale those at sort of a regional level, maybe working with retailers and other partners in that space. So just to say that we do report out annually. We started with our baseline report in 2020 to see how far we were from our targets, and we're reporting every year, and we'll be launching or publishing our next report very soon, and using that to inform, where we need to double down. Data, as I mentioned, is very important. We undertook an IC&I waste flow study in British Columbia, including sectors like agriculture, and that was with the BC government, and looking at potentially exploring a national study on this as a next step with the federal government. And lastly, I think when we're now in that phase where we've got a lot of guidance, we've got the roadmap direction, and we've got the partners at the table, how do we scale that on the ground with actual projects and work? So we've been supporting pilot projects and innovation areas like integrating PCR into shrink wrap, areas like PCR in stand-up pouches, and moving to more mono material polyethylene in those pouches, looking at curbside collection to allow for different types of collection models and seeing what works and what doesn't. The Digimark trial, which you may be familiar with, which is a European technology. We've been working to look at the sorting technology, essentially, that puts a invisible digital watermark on packaging and allows optical sorting to sort the flexible packaging based on different types of criteria, like their resins, resin types and structures, and allow for a higher quality of sortation of material at the end of the day. And now looking at phase 2 of that in Canada. So lots more pilots and projects on the horizon. And just to say that, if you're not part of the CPP or you'd like to learn more, this really is going to be an opportunity to bring all of the stakeholders together, and we'll need to do that to have effective action in this space. And so welcome you to join our movement. Reach out if you'd like more information about the CPP. I'll drop a link in the chat box, and happy to have a discussion with the other panel members shortly and answer questions. That, I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Paul. That was a lot of fabulous information. We will move straight along to Norm. So Norm, if you want to share your screen, that would be great.
So thank you, Nancy, for inviting me to speak today, and pleasure to be speaking today with the other panelists, Paul and Dana. Look forward to the Q&A that's going to follow. I'm going to give you a slightly different perspective. Paul talked about all of the groups that need to be involved, and we're on the recycler side. So we're part of the value chain in recycling. And what I will talk to you guys today about is waste diversion in Nova Scotia. Talk to you a bit about who we are, what we do, and some of our successes and pain points for food packaging materials in particular, because there's a lot of good things that we are doing today that we need to continue to do more of. And there are areas definitely for improvement opportunities as well. So who are we? So Scotia Recycling has been around since 1976. So we've been a recycler in Atlantic, Canada for 47 years, well before people were talking about recycling. Environmental stewardship is in our DNA. And it started with our founder, Roy Jodry, in 1927. So when people talk about recycling and good business need to happen together. And we're firm believers that that is part of how we're going to solve this recycling challenge that we have across Canada and the globe, and making sure that they go hand in hand, that recyclers, recycling, and good business practices go hand in hand. We did start as part of vertical integration. So when we talk about circular economy, we've been part of the circular economy on one key facet, which was the fiber side. We are looking at continuing to do that on the plastic side as well. So it started with us collecting recycled cardboard, recycled newsprint and paper, and feeding it back to our mills, and the mills using that product to make new products to put into the customers' hands. We've got facilities across Atlantic Canada, which gives us a perspective to talk about what is happening from a recycling world here in Canada, in Atlantic Canada as a whole. And we work with various groups. So we do deal with municipal waste. We also deal with the IC&I sector as well. So again, give you perspective on both of those sides. And really what we're doing is we're collecting the materials, we're sorting it, we're then baling it and bulking it up, and then working with mills who are transforming this material into a key manufacturing resource. And you can see up top, that is what our mission is, making sure that we're playing our role within that group, within that piece. We operate all value chains. So we've got 3 Murphs, material recovery facilities. As I said, we deal with the IC&I sector, and we're also involved in the deposit sector, so beverage deposit side. So again, give you that perspective in the list of materials that we deal with, all the grades of fiber, plus all the grades of plastics, aluminums, tins, poly-coated milk cartons, gable Tetra packs that we see within the industry. So again, some perspective on all of that. So Atlantic Canadian company. What are some of the things that are impacting us from a recycling and recyclability? And I have this discussion with people time in, time out. We talk about recycling. Technically, most materials are recyclable. The difference between are they recyclable and are they being recycled has, there's several steps that impact it. Probably the biggest one is an end market capable of receiving the recycled material, the collected sort of material, and what we do with it. The other piece that really impacts us is the cleanliness of the materials that we receive at our Murph facilities. A lot of consumers are confused on what this means. How clean does a container need to be? There's confusion. There's definitely an opportunity for further education. The other piece that that we have seen that tremendously improves recyclability is the 2-bag recycling streams that we have in Atlantic Canada, most of Atlantic Canada. One recycling stream that contains fibers and one that contains the beverage containers and other containers that go into the system. And that really helps us maximize high quality recycling of products coming into us. Glass is definitely a challenge for Murphs, operators like ourselves, having glass in the blue bags because it breaks easily, cuts, it's heavy, causes us issues. And then the other piece that is really challenging the recyclers like ourselves are the non-conforming materials that are being put into these into the blue bags by consumers. And that's a bit of confusion out there. So consumers not truly understanding what should or shouldn't go into the bag, as well as materials that are not recyclable or cannot be recycled because there is no end market coming into the bags. So compliance becomes a big issue for recycling and for the successes that we see from a recycler like ourselves. So this is where regular, consistent communication, education become key to successes that we're going to have within the system. And I've got some pictures here of varied materials. I had done a similar discussion at the Waste Resource Association of Nova Scotia. Was in person. I was able to do a show and tell and show the people in the room what are the materials that are coming in through the blue bags, and really just emphasize the lack of understanding by consumers, the need for education. We saw anything and everything coming into the bags, everything from car plastic headlights. So consumers thinking plastic is recyclable, I'm going to throw my headlight into the blue bag. Metal products, pipes coming in into the blue bag. So wide variety of materials coming in, and this really challenges recyclers like ourselves and impedes the ability to recycle as high rate as we want to get to. What are some of the trends that we see that will impact recycling in the near term? ESG has had an impact. Corporations who need to show that they're good stewards need to have a well-defined program that talks about how are they going to be responsible for the environment, how are they going to make sure they're taking care of the social impacts that they're having on the world that we operate in. And good governance is critical for any organization. So that is a positive in our view. We'll push companies, a lot of these manufacturers, to make sure that the products they put on markets are not only technically recyclable, but have the ability to be recycled. EPR, as it expands, extended producer responsibility, is critical. Labeling regulations. So Government of Canada last fall had a series of consultations that they undertook, talking about recycling and labeling on packaging materials, on whether they are widely recyclable or not, and making sure that when a manufacturer puts the chasing arrows symbol, that consumers have clarity on what does that mean. The government mandates. Paul talked about targets of getting to 30% recycled content within packaging. That'll definitely support the recycling and the recyclability of materials coming in. Volumes, the evolving volumes, and these are challenges that are out there. Lightweighting of materials. We see it in PET bottles. We see it in the PET thermoforms that come into to our streams. They take up a lot of volume. They make bulking up that much more difficult, and the cost of handling those materials just continues to rise. So that is one of the areas that will have an impact, and we need to understand how we're going to evolve to be able to address those impacts to us as well. Online retailers, online retailing as a whole, creating a lot more shipping containers, creating non-compliant packaging materials coming in. You know, when something is shipped from overseas without the same level of regulations that comes into our recycling streams, it does challenge us, and it makes accountability and traceability that much more difficult to handle. Data technologies and equipment, and again, it's one point that Paul talked about. Technology is our friend and will be our friend. So Murph's had been largely manual sorting with limited space. So to handle the variety of materials that are coming in, we will need to modernize these facilities. For recyclers, their need for monomaterials, that does pose a challenge. The inability to handle coated materials, and when we talk about replacing some of the plastics, and people think automatically, let's move to a fiber product. Well, if the fiber is coated with a polyethylene coating or some other plastic coating, it brings challenges. So we haven't really fixed the problem. We've simply modified where the problem is going. So that will continue to be a challenge. And then really, it's back to what Paul talked about, the 9 golden rules for design. Really need manufacturers and their ability to come into the market to be able to accept different materials and to put recycling capabilities to handle these materials. So the whole supply chain needs to work together to really drive recyclability. We're doing our part. We're doing what we can. We have modernized our main Murph in Kentfield, Nova Scotia, added some technology, including optical sorters, to help us identify the materials by material type to improve the quality of recycling. And we've also added high equipment balers to allow better densification of the product and really reduce our gas footprint by making sure that transportation is as cost effective as possible. And we're sending as much materials away to markets as we can in one load. As I talked about, this game is all about the circular economy and closing the loop on recycling. There are some great current successes out there. As a recycler, this is probably the bit of information that shocks most consumers that don't know this industry. When you talk to them about how much good we're currently doing, cardboard, OCC, fine paper, mixed papers, sorted residential newsprint, HDPE, polypropylene plastics, PET plastics, aluminum, metal, and tin cans are all currently being recycled effectively. There are good end markets for these products, and we're doing a lot of good as long as the materials come to us, that we're collecting them, and that we're not leaving these materials going to garbage. As long as consumers are diverting them to the blue bags, we are collecting them, sorting them, and effectively recycling them into the markets. There's some great current successes with these materials. There's several others that pose challenges because they're a bit more complicated. Beer cartons, people would say, what's the problem here? Well, often with beer cartons that you're getting glass in them, you're getting metal. So you need systems to be able to handle those. Styrofoam, EPS, I know there's a ban going on. EPS is recyclable. We do have a facility that does collect expanded polystyrene. We are densifying and we're shipping it out. Not easy. It's difficult, it's bulky, but it's doable. We talked about Murph films. Polyethylene films are being recycled in Atlantic, Canada. The challenge is there's a lot of lookalikes and very difficult to distinguish the different materials. So we are doing it. We've moved a lot of product out, and we are sending it to manufacturers who are converting these materials into other products. We're recycling magazine stock, you know, the high gloss inks, gable top containers, poly-coated material, milk cartons, Tetra Paks are all being recycled. And coming to the end of the presentation, we get to the harder to recycle materials. So glass continues to be a tough one for us because of proximity of glass recycling facilities. There are none in Atlantic Canada. It's heavy, it breaks easily, so it is a challenge. Clamshells, thermoforms. I know it's a growing package for many people in the food and beverage, food industry in particular. It does pose a challenge, and the biggest challenge that it poses is there isn't a reliable stream of plastic converters who are accepting thermoform in large quantities. So although PET can be recycled, PET clamshells can be recycled, we are having challenges finding anybody who wants to recycle. And again, challenges there, the various plastic forms that come in, the intrinsic density of thermoforms being lower than that of PET bottles, and the labels that come in bring a challenge to that material. The rigids in the marketplace that consumers think they're hangers, they're children's toys that aren't identified as monomer plastics are really difficult to handle. And then the final category, which really is a lot of the other flexible packaging that's out there. That is a mixed plastic material identified often as number 7s. You know, these do bring a challenge, and what they do to a Murph operator like us, it does add to contaminating the good film stream of polyethylene that is in the market. So driving less of these materials in the system, having technologies that can potentially pick them out, as Paul talked about, are all things that are going to help us get there.
Thank you, Norm. That was lots of really awesome information as well. And we're going to jump into Dana's presentation. So when you're ready, Dana, you can share.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Nancy, and you know, Adam, for getting us all set up here today, and for all of you tuning in. I really appreciate being invited to talk about this topic. I feel a little less like an expert than Norm or Paul, who are working in this recycling space every day. In contrast, I'm more of a generalist. I work with the Canadian Food Innovation Network, as you can see on my slides, and what we do, and the perspective I'm going to bring to you is as a champion of the food industry. So CFIN has been around for about 18 months. We have very close. This morning it was 2,398 members. I'm like, oh darn, I can't say 2,400 to this group, but we use our membership and even excuse me, people working within the food industry externally to really understand their problems, so we can champion the innovation required to help them to grow their businesses. So I come at this from their perspective, and then I also have had a long time in my career where I've been sort of the voice of the consumer. So I'm going to show you some consumer insights as well. And I think I'm going to cover some of the ground that Norm and Paul have covered, but maybe in a slightly different way. I do want to tell you that Paul's stats don't jive with all of my stats, and I would suggest that you trust his stats over ours. We did extensive research, but I know that the Canada Plastics Pact, they work on this every single day, and they do a lot more of their own quantitative research. So where you see differences in the numbers I show, please, I think, defer to Paul's. They don't conflict with one another and try to tell a different story. They just aren't necessarily all taken from the same place. So, you know, as you heard in Paul's presentation, plastics, there's a lot of plastics used, and this is one place where our numbers weren't matching. But it doesn't really matter to me what the specific number is. The fact is, we're using a whole lot of plastic in food production, and there are really good reasons for that. We have to remember that people who are in business in the food industry, they have two groups they have to please. The first one is the end consumer, so the person who who goes through the store, picks things up and puts them into their cart and goes to the checkout, but they also have to please the retailer. So over the past 25, probably 50 years, those two groups have told industry that they wanted lighter weight packaging and that they wanted things that weren't breakable, and they wanted cardboard that was, you know, easy to crush and to take up less room when they were disposing of it, and that they wanted, you know, information on the package, which has led to, you know, some of the things that Norm just talked about, that dirty styrofoam, for instance. Instead of, you know, putting a sticker, we've started to put messaging right onto the packages. So you know, I obviously the industry perspective is very important to me, and I don't want to say, oh, poor industry, but I just want to remind you of how we got to where we are, and that, you know, when people talk about industry's responsibility in this space, they're sometimes limited by what their customers, the retailers, and their consumers, you and I, what we'll buy. So we have to be very vocal, I think, as consumers when we're telling industry and grocers what is important to us. So as we've heard, and I will not belabor this slide, we really have you know, a lot of stuff going into waste streams. And I think this is really a problem, but we also have this backlog of whatever many years since we started to use plastic in landfills already and floating around in all kinds of spaces. So it's not just what we do in 1 year that is an issue. It's, you know, what is also, you know, accumulated. And I hear very few people talking about that type of rehabilitation for land and that kind of thing. I would love sometime when I get an opportunity to actually talk more with Paul about that myself. You'll see I popped into the chat that our CEO has been able to sit down with Paul and have a conversation with him. And I urge you to watch that video. I learned a lot from it. So Canadians, and when I talk about Canadians, I'm talking about consumers. I just, you know, I'm using that catch-all term because pretty much everybody, whether you're the person who's doing the purchasing or someone's purchasing it for you, are consumers. So our consumers tell us that they really want to eliminate plastic, but they also, you know, as you'll see in that bottom point about sustainable packaging and the on-pack claims, they also are getting a ton of information. And Norm, please don't take this the wrong way, but a lot of the terminology you used in your presentation was new for me, like Murph, for instance. I hadn't heard that before. So when we're thinking about consumers and we're thinking about what's on packages, we really have to, as people inside this topic and in industry, we really need to be super clear. One of the things that I'm quite concerned about that's an emerging trend is how many food businesses are starting to market themselves as net zero companies and that kind of thing. It doesn't mean a lot to a consumer, and they don't necessarily respond to those claims if they don't understand them. And when you start to unpack some of these types of terminologies, it gets really thorny. So for instance, does net zero mean that you have changed the way you run your business and you run your business in a way that is better than other businesses, or does it mean you bought carbon credits? So, you know, you really have to think about your packaging as a communication piece, but because of limited space, I think you have to think of that as you know, a space where you start conversations and then incorporate into your marketing and branding strategy more information so that consumers can understand these things. And I'm so grateful that we do have groups like the Canadian Plastics Pact and like you know, all of the consumer focus groups and industry focus groups who can help with some of this dissemination of information. So, we've got this problem with adoption, and it's this gap, which is a classic gap between consumers' intentions and actions. And a lot of the times we see as marketers, these types of gaps happen because there's a big difference between what you do and what you say you do. And this is, if you've heard me speak before, you might have heard me use this analogy, but it's just so evergreen. If you ask me right now what I'm going to do tonight, I'm going to tell you I'm going to put on my running shoes, or grab my running shoes because it's snowy here, and go to the gym and get on the treadmill for half an hour. If you ask me what I did last night, which is, should have been pretty similar to what I would do tonight, being a middle of the week night. The fact is I watched Jeopardy and I had a glass of wine in my running shoes. So, that there's the difference, right? I intend to go to the gym. Do I get there all the time? No. So we have to remember that this is sort of a human issue. I am most interested, though, in bringing your attention to that middle bullet point on this slide. You may remember, at least in my part of Canada, and this is another issue I'll address in a moment or two. In my part of Canada, we had a rebate for buying compact fluorescent light bulbs a few years ago. And so my husband got right on that and changed all of our light bulbs in our house, and he got a rebate. Programs like that are great, but they do set a precedent. And so now, as we're asking consumers to adopt something greener in another aspect of their lives, you see how many of them are expecting to have the government support that kind of activity. So keep that in mind. We have a lot of interesting things happening here in Canada right now at the national level. We're seeing, we have a coalition government, and we have a very strong new challenger for the leadership of Canada, making a lot of noise. And what's going to be in our next election? And I don't know. I would not put my money on seeing a discount or a rebate for buying packaging that is, an alternative to the things that we're struggling with. So, as I mentioned, one of the reasons that this is so difficult for Canadians is that gap between intention and action. But Norm said this extremely well. We also have a need to align communication so that everyone is getting the same information. And I would say we need to have municipalities, at least in the same province, doing the same thing. I live in Ontario. Where I am, I can recycle all kinds of things. I have a really great green bin program. We get our recycling picked up every week, so it doesn't, pile up in our homes, and all kinds of, I think our system from the consumer standpoint works quite well. My sister-in-law, who lives in Ottawa, she has many fewer supports. So she's, of course, throwing out more stuff, not because she's has any different feelings about recycling than I do. And then, of course, there's the issue that if manufacturers are out there developing new packaging for their national brands and launching them in national chains, we have a big problem in that these municipalities within provinces, not to mention within the whole country, have very different capabilities of what they can compost and what they can break down. And I think that probably makes Norm's job way, way harder. So this isn't something that his company can tackle on their own. It's a really big issue. And I think something that needs to be considered at a national level with, say, our MPs. So, I would say that if this is important to you, that we all should start a letter writing campaign to our MPs and get them the same way they get together to talk about healthcare, the same way they get together to talk about, other big important issues like COVID, that they should get together and talk about recycling as a group of provinces. So this slide just kind of recaps the things that I've said, but again, I want to underline that recycling misinformation, labeling confusion, lack of standardization, and the fact that it definitely in these inflationary times, people are incented to make the choice that's right for their family today, not always the choice that's right for the planet long term. So we need to consider that consumer driver as well. My slide just does one little example. Norm had a whole bunch of examples that showed, what actually happens to things that are put into recycle. I found this really interesting information though, because it shows how we really don't either get enough information in a consistent enough manner, or I'm not sure what, to be honest, but we really don't have great knowledge as consumers. So as you can see, consumers when they were surveyed, didn't really think that metal got recycled all that often, and actually it does. And plastic, they thought it got recycled a lot more often than it does. So this to me is just a really great snapshot of the problem that is plaguing our consumers as they try to navigate this space. And they really, their intentions show us that they are. So one of the things that CFIN does is we provide funding for companies who are doing projects that will help to do something really new and innovative. And last spring, in June, we did what we call a food innovation challenge, which are large projects between $2 and $4 million of co-funding to help companies tackle really big problems. We'll be announcing the winners of that challenge in, I don't know, probably about a month. We have identified them and who the winners will be, and it's everything's getting validated right now. But before we go and do a big funding round, we also try to put out some thought leadership, and we try to get involved with understanding what industry is doing and thinking. So for instance, the interview I mentioned at the Futures Paul was part of our plastics thought leadership campaign. So as you can see, this is where the kind of information that we pulled together. You'll see that the numbers are not, these are not, round whole numbers that make up 100, but these are some of the numbers we gathered. This information is all on our Yodel Innovation Connector platform as well, which is free. So, and more. Moving along, we asked Canadian companies to tell us what they cared about. What were they talking about around their boardrooms? So as you can see, food manufacturers, food service companies, retailers, they are, reducing plastics is a priority for them, and they're working on it. There's a group that isn't, though. They don't know necessarily what to do. Only about 10% of them are hearing it from their customers. So I think that's, or say that they have heard it from their customers and they're not discussing it yet. So, we can't blame industry for not caring, I think is the takeaway there. Interestingly, the barriers for these companies, though, are that the new solutions are expensive. They are already set up to use particular things, and they don't have budget. They also have a real lack of time or resources. A lot of companies that have had to become very lean during the pandemic, and then now during the inflationary times, I almost said the R word, they don't necessarily have people working on this, and it's hard for them to find those companies. So if you are someone working in this space, I got companies who are looking for you, and you can post about yourself on Yodel. And then, as I say, there's a lot of mismatch between the solutions and the types of products that folks are making. So these are what the alternatives that we see industry using. I think from what I saw that some of these are in Norm's slides as well. But when I look at things like these compostable plastics and plant-based items, they often have freshness and shelf life implications, and sometimes actually can't be composted in municipal systems. And so, a lot of expense and a lot of time and trouble goes into creating things that only end up in the garbage anyhow. So basically, this is just a summary. We see that that industry wants to be more circular. They're trying to use new materials and reduce their needs, and they are responding to what government puts into place, but it's not easy for them. Anyhow, long story short, I just wanted to point out to you, this is a little more info about Yodel, but I'll save that for another day. If any of you wants to find out more about this, Tyson McInnes, my colleague, your Regional Innovation Director for Atlantic, is on this call, and you can ping him or me anytime. So thanks, Nancy.
Awesome. Thank you so much. There's lots of awesome information there. We have a couple questions that have come in. A couple were already mentioned, sort of answered more directly. I'm just going to mention there was a question about talks within municipalities and regions, which I can't really tell how that was answered, but I think it is worth repeating whoever answered it. How is there going to be better harmonization between municipalities and regions? I know this is something maybe Paul could speak to, or somebody else.
Happy to start, but there's others on the line here too that deal with this day to day. So my comment in the answered box was, that largely in provinces where they exist, producer responsibility organizations like Recycle BC or some of the stewardship agencies and others have been working on the messaging because they're the interface with the consumer in terms of like the blue box programs or their collection programs. That's not always the case across Canada, but as EPR is starting to roll out an extended producer responsibility, that harmonized messaging at a regional level will be extremely important. And obviously the education and awareness raising needs to be ramped up. And that means working really closely with local governments and NGOs, and Canada Plastics Pact is also looking where we play a role there. And that relates to the labeling conversations that are going on with the federal government and others. But maybe I'll pass that to Norm or anyone else on the line here. The role of local governments to harmonize the message with consumers.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Oh, go ahead, Bob.
Go ahead, Bob. No.
The question was around what is collected curbside as not being consistent between municipalities. Sorry, just for clarification.
Correct.
Okay, so the vast majority of materials that go into the organic stream and the recycling stream are actually quite consistent. There are some variations, expanded polystyrene and a few others, but they're relatively small relative to the volume that's received in the blue bags, but they're important. And we have been working on extended producer responsibility regulations for some time now. The government has committed itself to more EPR. So if it occurs and the industry, if the regulation is passed and the industry takes over, as Paul was just mentioning, they will come up with a consistent message across the province, and it will be one type of material that is collected. And right now, I think municipalities have over the years been working together, communicating with each other, try to harmonize where those smaller differences exist. There's been some level of change, but when someone wants to innovate and add extended polystyrene, it'll take a while for everybody to add it. So there will be an inconsistency for some time. But hopefully, once EPR is passed, you will see complete consistency and the same message across the province with regards to education.
Okay, we have a question here from Gary. Plastics play an important role in food safety, but it leads to plastic products that are difficult to recycle. And I think mainly there we might be talking about materials that are not monomaterials. That seems to be the most difficult plastics to recycle, or the not readily recyclable types. Are there any developments in recycling plastics for this purpose? So I know we did touch briefly on monomaterials, and I kind of have a question myself about that, but I'll let somebody else answer that first. If we're talking, for example, for films that go over, raw products like meat or things like that, there doesn't seem to be a lot of easy replacements for those.
I can tell you that the applications we got for the Food Innovation Challenge about plastics did contain several projects that were working on plastic films, some to be more recyclable and more antimicrobial. So there's some people who are tackling that from, both perspectives, but, I can't get anything specific to this group.
I can add a bit there. Just, we have a working group on flexibles, and that includes a focus on moving away from multi-material laminates to mono-material polyethylene or polypropylene, with PE being the preference. And we recognize that, traditionally flexibles have maybe been over-engineered, but there's there's a need for the layers that protect for, gas barriers and moisture and other things. But there's a lot of innovation and investment going on in R&D and other spaces where now mono material or polyethylene layers can perform almost as well or better in some cases to the original barriers that were there, whether it was metallization coatings or PVOH coatings, etc. There's a lot of innovation going on because it is a global focus for companies, brand owners, manufacturers to move in that direction. So less of a concern as it was maybe a few years back.
And I know that the monomaterial stand-up pouches, for example, which we have a couple of suppliers in Nova Scotia that sell those, they say they're equally effective for like frozen foods, etc. And they come pre-approved for the How to Recycle logo. So I would love to see more people adopting that if they're selling, for example, frozen fruits, vegetables, etc. And I just kind of wonder, like, how come it's not more known and adopted? Because it seems like such a sweet solution.
In some ways it's going back to how things were a few years back, but the challenge is sometimes it can be more costly to run those mono material PE manufacturing lines. They have to run at a slower speed because of heat or other things such as that. So it's often a cost conversation about converting back to mono material.
Mm-hmm.
Because of that, it's like the Titanic. They've been going down this road for 20 years, and now the industry is very focused on it, which is very welcome because of plastics, attention to plastics litter in the environment and extended producer responsibility. So we've seen a sea change of interest from industry, and we see substantial amounts of money being invested. So they're very welcome, but it's going to be like the Titanic. It's going to take some time to transition.
And again, if I can just add, just from my perspective, I think part of the challenge that's out there is the plastic converters, and the plastic converters needing to adapt their technologies to allow trace amounts of, what they would call contaminants. So EVM, EVOH would be an example, right? So they can accept it in polyethylene films up to a certain percentage, but beyond that, it's not acceptable within their traditional processes. So this is an evolution that has to happen. The plastic recyclers, the converters, need to adjust their technologies to allow them to take more of these trace materials within their systems.
We just have time probably for one more question here. From a plastic food packaging manufacturer perspective, is the industry heading towards recycling, composting, or other directions for product end of life? It's going to be a combination, I think, maybe, because does anyone want to elaborate on that?
We'll probably have best, but it's probably going to be a combination. The compostable ones are a bit concerning. We're watching that with great interest. What is a plastic compostable? There's lots of challenges with that, microplastics and whatnot. They have a significant challenge in that area. But recyclability is certainly making strides that I think we will always welcome.
Okay.
I was going to say I agree with Robert on that.
We might actually see in some cases, dare I say, not mixed waste incineration, but there are applications where something is so dirty and so difficult to recycle that it might be used in something like a cement kiln, which needs a specification for its fuel, not garbage. So I throw that out there as something that's going to be talked about in the long run, but it usually has a negative connotation.
Okay, it's unfortunately time to move the conversation to another time. And thank you all so much for attending and for being part of this this webinar. I greatly appreciate the input from our speakers, and thank you all again for your expertise and for sharing the time.